At midnight, my stepfather kicked down my door and attacked me, breaking bones and dislocating my shoulder, while my mother just stood there watching. I begged for help before collapsing. What happened next left even the police horrified. The night my stepfather dislocated my shoulder and shattered my sense of safety was also the night my own mother stood by, utterly frozen. That terrifying moment, on my 25th birthday, irrevocably changed everything. You see, my name is Louise, and I'm 32 now, a trauma therapist in Boston. But 7 years ago, I was just turning 25, and my life was about to explode. Before Frank, my childhood was pretty peaceful. My biological dad passed when I was 8, from lung cancer, leaving just me and my mom, Diane. For 4 years, it was just us two in our small suburban home outside Boston. Mom worked 2 jobs, constantly exhausted, but she always made time for me. We had movie nights, baked cookies, she never missed a school event. Those years were tough financially, but our bond? It was unbreakable. Then, when I turned 12, everything shifted. Mom met Frank at the bank where she'd started as a teller. He was the branch manager, seemed so respectable, stable. I still remember the first time she brought him home. He brought Mom flowers, and for me, a book about astronomy because Mom had told him I loved stars. He was charming, attentive, genuinely interested in getting to know me. I was hesitant, still missing my dad, but Frank never pushed. He took things slow, always including me in their outings to the zoo or museum. 6 months later, he proposed. They married when I was 13. A small, elegant wedding, just what Mom wanted. Frank had money, way more than we were used to, and he moved us into his sprawling colonial house in an upscale neighborhood. I finally got my own room, with a brand new computer and bookshelf. For a few months, honestly, it felt perfect. But the changes started subtly. Frank insisted on managing all the finances. He convinced Mom to close her personal bank account, merge everything with his. His explanations were so logical: it's more efficient, we'll save on fees, we're a family now. Mom agreed, too easily perhaps, desperate to believe she found security again. Then he started having opinions about Mom's friends. Karen was too gossipy. Susan was a bad influence with her divorce talk. Jennifer spent too frivolously and might encourage Mom to do the same. One by one, Mom's social circle just vanished. She stopped reaching out, trying to avoid Frank's disapproving comments. Phone calls dwindled, visits became non-existent. I saw Mom changing, too. The woman who once sang while cooking now moved silently around the kitchen. She checked with Frank before making any purchases, even small ones. Her vibrant wardrobe gave way to conservative clothes Frank deemed appropriate. She even stopped wearing the bright red lipstick she always loved. The first time I saw Frank's real anger, I was 14. Mom had bought a dress without consulting him. It wasn't expensive, just a simple sundress for a staff picnic, but Frank exploded. He didn't hit her that time, but he threw his dinner plate against the wall. It shattered, spaghetti sauce dripping down our cream-colored wallpaper like blood. He called her irresponsible, financially reckless, ungrateful. Mom apologized, repeatedly. She returned the dress the next day. And she never shopped alone again. By high school, I developed strategies to minimize contact. I joined every after-school club, studied at the library, spent weekends at friends' houses. When I was home, I stayed in my room, door closed, emerging only when absolutely necessary. Frank never explicitly forbade these activities. I think he preferred me out of the way. My relationship with Mom deteriorated. I resented her for changing, for choosing Frank over our once close bond. When I tried to talk to her about his controlling behavior, she dismissed me. "You don't understand adult relationships," she'd say. "Frank takes care of us. We're lucky to have him." Eventually, I just stopped trying. We lived in the same house but existed in separate worlds. In my junior year, I walked in on Mom covering a bruise on her cheek with makeup. She claimed she'd walked into a door in the dark, but her eyes wouldn't meet mine in the mirror. That was it. That was the moment I knew, with sickening certainty, Frank had escalated from emotional to physical abuse. I begged her to leave. She refused, insisting it was just a one-time mistake, that Frank had been stressed about work. I knew better. But at 16, I felt utterly powerless to help someone who wouldn't help herself. The next 2 years were a careful dance of avoidance and planning. I maintained perfect grades, knowing education was my ticket out. I researched colleges far from home, applied for every scholarship, worked part-time at a local bookstore to save money. Frank seemed pleased with my academic success, probably viewing it as a reflection of his good parenting, and largely left me alone. When my acceptance letter from Boston University arrived, with a substantial scholarship, I finally felt like I could breathe. Frank was surprisingly supportive. Again, it reflected well on him. Mom seemed torn between pride and fear. The night before I left for college, after Frank was asleep, Mom came to my room. "I'm proud of you," she whispered, sitting on the edge of my bed like she used to when I was little. "You're going to do amazing things." There was something in her voice, a mixture of sadness and longing that made my heart ache. "Come with me," I said impulsively. "We could get an apartment together. You could find a job in Boston." She shook her head, that familiar look of resignation settling over her features. "This is my life now, Louise, but it doesn't have to be yours. Promise me you'll build a good life, no matter what." The next morning, Frank drove us to Boston in tense silence. He played the devoted stepfather, carrying my boxes, performing for my roommate and her parents. When it was time to leave, Mom hugged me tightly, whispering, "I love you." Frank gave me an awkward pat and a check for emergencies. I never cashed it. My first semester at college was like emerging from a dark cave into sunlight. I made friends who knew nothing about my home life, joined study groups, even tried out for the debate team. My roommate, Zoe, introduced me to her eclectic group of friends. For the first time in years, I felt normal, unburdened by the constant tension of living with Frank. I declared psychology my major sophomore year, driven by a desperate need to understand what had happened to my family. Why did Mom stay? Why did Frank need to control and hurt? Could I have done something differently? My professors noticed my intensity, my hunger for answers. Professor Sarah Levine, a specialist in trauma and domestic violence, became my mentor, eventually a friend. One day, during office hours, I finally opened up about Frank and Mom. Instead of pity, she offered understanding and practical advice. She recommended books, connected me with support groups for adult children of abusive households, and encouraged me to consider therapy. The patterns we grow up with shape us, she explained. But they don't have to define us. Understanding them is the first step to breaking free. Communication with Mom became harder and harder. Our phone calls were brief, superficial, always when Frank was at work. She never shared anything meaningful, deflecting my questions with vague assurances that everything was fine. I went home for holidays freshman year, but the atmosphere was so stifling, I found excuses to stay at school after that. Mom would visit me occasionally, always alone, always looking over her shoulder as if Frank might materialize behind her. To support myself, I worked at the university library 20 hours a week. The quiet, organized environment was soothing, and my supervisor was flexible. I was determined to be financially independent, refusing any money connected to Frank. I lived frugally, shopped at thrift stores, learned to cook cheap, healthy meals. Junior year, I met Eric in my abnormal psychology class. He was studying to be a clinical social worker, passionate about helping at-risk youth. Unlike the few guys I'd casually dated, Eric was patient, perceptive. He noticed when certain topics made me uncomfortable and never pushed. Gradually, I told him about my family, testing his reactions with small revelations before trusting him with the full story. "Your mom needs help," he said after hearing it all. "But so do you. Having a parent in an abusive relationship affects you, too, even from a distance." With Eric's encouragement, I started seeing a therapist through the University Counseling Center. Dr. Melissa helped me work through my complicated feelings of love, anger, and guilt regarding Mom, and my fear and resentment of Frank. Slowly, I began to understand that I couldn't save Mom if she wasn't ready to leave, but I could build my own healthy life. I graduated summa cum laude, Professor Levine writing glowing recommendations for grad programs. Mom attended my graduation ceremony, sitting alone in the audience. Frank claimed a work emergency. She looked older than her 47 years, her once vibrant brown hair streaked with gray, her posture slightly stooped as if perpetually bracing for impact. We went to dinner, just us two, at a small Italian restaurant. "I always knew you'd do something special," she said, genuinely smiling. "For the first time in years, your father would have been so proud." I took her hand across the table. "I'm staying in Boston. I found an apartment and a job at a community mental health center. You can visit anytime. Stay as long as you want." She squeezed my hand, then withdrew it to fiddle with her napkin. "I'll try. Things are just busy with Frank's work schedule and the house." Her voice trailed off, and I knew she was afraid to make promises she couldn't keep. We parted with tight hugs and tentative plans for her to visit that summer. As I watched her taxi drive away, I wondered if I'd ever have my real mother back. After graduation, I settled into my one-bedroom apartment in Somerville, a short subway ride from downtown Boston. The rent stretched my budget thin, but having my own secure space was worth every penny. My job at the Riverside Community Mental Health Center was entry-level, assisting licensed therapists and sitting in on group sessions. The pay was modest, but the experience was invaluable, especially combined with the part-time grad courses I was taking in clinical psychology. 6 months into my new life, I received an unexpected message from Eric. We'd broken up amicably before graduation, both focused on careers, unsure about a long-distance relationship since he'd taken a job in Chicago. His message was simple: he was moving back to Boston for a new opportunity and wondered if I'd like to get coffee. Our reunion coffee turned into dinner, which evolved into regular dates. Eric had matured during our time apart, more confident, clearer about his goals. He now worked for a nonprofit, helping low-income families affected by addiction. We slipped back into our relationship with surprising ease, both more self-aware and better at communicating. One evening, during a video call with Mom, I noticed a yellowish bruise fading around her right eye. When I asked about it, she nervously adjusted her webcam and claimed she'd tripped on the stairs while carrying laundry. Plausible, maybe, if not for the way her eyes darted around, checking if Frank was within earshot. "Mom," I said gently. "You know you can tell me anything, right? If something is happening, I can help." "Everything is fine, sweetie," she insisted, plastering on a smile that didn't reach her eyes. "How's your new project at work going?" The abrupt change of subject was typical, but I decided not to push. Instead, I started calling more frequently, at different times, hoping to catch her when she felt safer to talk. I also befriended Catherine, a colleague who specialized in domestic violence cases. Without breaking confidentiality about Mom, I asked general questions about how abuse escalates and what resources were available. "The most dangerous time is when they try to leave," Catherine explained during one lunch break. "That's when control is threatened, and abusers often escalate to prevent losing their victim. Any escape plan needs to prioritize safety above all else." I started researching domestic violence shelters in my parents' area, saving phone numbers and addresses in a password-protected document. I looked into legal options, restraining orders, support groups, all while knowing none of it would help unless Mom was willing to take that first terrifying step. 3 months before my 25th birthday, Mom called while I was having dinner with Eric at my apartment. Her voice was shaking, barely audible. "He found the brochure," she whispered. "What brochure?" I asked, though I already suspected. "For the Women's Center, the one you mailed me." She was crying now, trying to keep quiet. "He went through my purse. He says I'm ungrateful, that I'm planning to leave him after everything he's done for me. He broke my phone. I'm using the neighbor's landline while he's out." My heart raced. "Mom, listen to me. Pack a small bag. Only essentials. I'll call you an Uber to the bus station. You can come stay with me. We'll figure everything out once you're safe." "I can't just leave," she protested weakly. "The house, my job, what would people think?" "None of that matters if you're not safe." I insisted. "Please, Mom. I'm afraid of what he might do." There was a long pause. "Maybe you're right," she finally said. "Let me think about it. I'll call you back tomorrow when he's at work." Eric, who'd been listening, looked concerned. "Do you think she's in immediate danger? Should we call the local police for a welfare check?" "I don't know," I admitted. "Frank's careful. He's never done anything that would get him arrested. If we call the police and nothing happens, it might just make things worse for her." We stayed up late discussing options, refining a safety plan for Mom. I barely slept, waiting for her call the next day. When it finally came, my heart sank at her first words. "Everything is fine now," she said, her voice unnaturally bright. "Frank and I had a good talk. He explained that he was just worried about me being influenced by negative people. We're going to start marriage counseling." I could hear the lie in every syllable. I could picture Frank standing next to her, monitoring every word. "Mom, are you sure?" "You know you can tell me if." "Absolutely sure," she interrupted. "Oh, Frank wants to say hello." Before I could protest, his voice came through the speaker, smooth and controlled as always. "Louise, how nice to hear you've been keeping in touch with your mother. I hope you're not filling her head with nonsense about our relationship." "I just want her to be safe and happy," I replied carefully. "She is both those things with me," he said. A subtle threat underlying his pleasant tone. "Perhaps you should focus on your own life instead of trying to interfere in ours. Family is sacred, Louise. Remember that." The call ended abruptly. Frantic with worry, I contacted the local police department and explained the situation. The officer was sympathetic but explained that without evidence of a crime or direct testimony from my mother, there was little they could do. If she calls and says she's in danger, we'll respond immediately, he assured me. But we can't force help on someone who isn't asking for it. Frustrated and scared, I tried calling Mom repeatedly over the next few weeks, but always got voicemail. The few text messages I received were clearly composed under Frank's supervision, generic updates about gardening projects and community events. As my birthday approached, the knot of anxiety in my stomach grew tighter. Something felt wrong, deeply wrong, but I was powerless to fix it from 200 miles away. My 25th birthday fell on a Friday in late October. The air was crisp, leaves crunching underfoot as I walked home from the subway. Normally, I would have planned a celebration. Instead, Eric had an unavoidable client emergency, so we'd agreed to celebrate the next evening. I'll make it up to you tomorrow, he promised, kissing me goodbye that morning. My colleagues had surprised me with cupcakes and a gift card at lunch. Throughout the day, birthday wishes trickled in. I tried calling Mom several times, no answer. I left a cheerful voicemail, no mention of the tension, just saying I loved her and hoped to hear from her soon. My apartment welcomed me with familiar comfort that evening. Third floor of a brownstone, high ceilings, wood floors, lots of light. Security was decent, key fob for the main entrance, solid locks on my door. I'd made it my own with second-hand furniture, plants, psychology articles framed on the walls. Small, but it felt safe. A sanctuary. I treated myself to Thai takeout, opened a bottle of wine, and settled on the couch with a novel. Around 9, Eric called to wish me happy birthday again, promising tomorrow's celebration would be worth the wait. By 11, I was in pajamas, drifting off to sleep. The pounding on my door jolted me awake. Disoriented, I fumbled for my phone. 12:17 a.m. The pounding continued, growing more insistent, interspersed now with a voice I recognized with horrifying clarity. Open this door, Louise. Frank's voice, slurred but unmistakable. I know you're in there. My heart raced. I crept to the door and looked through the peephole. Frank stood in the hallway, face flushed with anger, alcohol, or both. Behind him, partially obscured, stood my mother. Her expression, a mask of terror. Frank pounded again, the door shuddering. What are you doing here? I called through the door, trying to keep my voice steady while frantically typing a text to Eric with one hand. It's after midnight. We came to wish you happy birthday, Frank replied with a grotesque attempt at joviality. Open up, Louise. Don't be rude to your parents. Please, go away, I said, louder now. I'll call the police if you don't leave. That's when something in Frank snapped. You ungrateful little bitch, he roared, launching his body against the door with such force that the wood splintered around the lock. 2 more powerful kicks and the door gave way entirely, Frank stumbling into my apartment with murderous rage in his eyes. I backed away, phone clutched in my hand. I'm calling 911. I warned, fingers already dialing. Frank lunged forward with surprising speed. He knocked the phone from my hand, sending it skittering across the floor. Before I could react, his fingers tangled in my hair, yanking me forward so violently that pain exploded across my scalp. His other hand formed a fist that connected with my cheekbone, sending stars across my vision. Frank, stop! My mother's voice, thin and terrified, from the doorway. Please, you're hurting her. He ignored her, dragging me by the hair across the living room, slamming me into the wall. My head cracked against the plaster, dazing me momentarily. I tried to fight back, clawing at his face, kicking at his shins, but Frank outweighed me by at least 100 pounds. Mom, help me! I screamed, making eye contact with her over Frank's shoulder. She stood frozen in the doorway, hands covering her mouth, eyes wide with horror, but her body was utterly immobile. Please, Mom. Frank spun me around, grabbed my right arm, and twisted it behind my back, pushing upward with savage force. There was a sickening pop as my shoulder dislocated. Pain so intense that my vision tunneled to pinpricks of light in a sea of darkness. I screamed, the sound primal and agonized. This is what happens when you try to destroy a family. Frank hissed in my ear, his breath hot and reeking of whiskey. This is what you deserve. He slammed me against the wall again, my already injured shoulder taking the brunt of the impact. The pain was blinding, nauseating. I felt something crack in my ribcage as he punched me again, this time in the side. Another blow caught my temple, sending me sprawling to the floor. Through my swelling eyes, I saw my phone, just inches from my outstretched left hand. With the last of my strength, I lunged for it, my fingers finding the emergency SOS button I'd programmed. 3 quick presses sent my location to emergency services. Frank's foot connected with my ribs again, and I curled into a protective ball, tasting blood, feeling consciousness slipping away. The last thing I remember before darkness claimed me was my mother's face, tears streaming down her cheeks, her mouth forming words I could no longer hear. In the distance, sirens wailed, growing louder then fading as I slipped into unconsciousness. The steady beeping of a heart monitor pulled me from darkness. My eyelids felt impossibly heavy, but I managed to open them to a blur of white ceiling and fluorescent lights. Pain radiated from seemingly everywhere, particularly my right shoulder and rib cage. A warm pressure on my left hand drew my attention, and I turned my head slightly to see Eric sitting beside the hospital bed, his fingers intertwined with mine, his head bowed in what looked like prayer or exhaustion. "Eric," I tried to say, but it came out as a rasp. His head snapped up, relief washing over his tired features. "Louise," he whispered, leaning closer. "Thank God. Let me get the nurse." He pressed a button, and moments later a nurse bustled in, followed by a doctor. They checked my vitals, asked me questions, and explained my injuries. "You have a dislocated right shoulder, which we reduced while you were unconscious," the doctor explained. "2 fractured ribs on your right side, facial contusions, and a mild concussion. You were lucky the police arrived when they did. Do you remember what happened?" The memories flooded back in horrifying clarity, Frank breaking down my door, the first punch, my mother watching, the sickening pop of my shoulder. I nodded slowly, wincing at the pain the movement caused. "Frank," I managed. "My stepfather, he attacked me. My mother was there, too." "Are they?" "Your stepfather is in custody," Eric said, his voice tight with controlled anger. "The police arrested him at the scene. Your mother is in the waiting room. She's been here all night, but was afraid to come in." A police officer arrived shortly after, a woman with kind eyes and a notebook. She introduced herself as Officer Rivera and explained she needed my statement while events were still fresh. With Eric holding my hand for support, I recounted everything, from the midnight pounding on my door to losing consciousness as sirens approached. "We have your stepfather in custody on charges of breaking and entering, assault and battery," Officer Rivera confirmed. "Your emergency call recorded parts of the attack, and the evidence of forced entry is clear. Your injuries and the medical report will support the case. The question now is whether you want to press charges." "Yes," I said without hesitation. "I want him prosecuted to the fullest extent possible." Officer Rivera nodded. "Good. Too often in domestic cases, victims are afraid to go forward. There will be paperwork to sign when you're feeling better. We'll also need to talk about a restraining order." After she left, Eric filled in the gaps. He received my partial text and called the police himself when I didn't answer his frantic callbacks. He arrived at my apartment shortly after the ambulance, finding the door smashed in and blood on the living room wall. The police had Frank handcuffed in a patrol car and were trying to calm my hysterical mother. "She's been a mess," Eric said gently, alternating between crying and completely shutting down. "She gave a statement to the police that confirms everything you said. I think she's in shock." I was still processing this when a soft knock came at the door. My mother stood there, looking smaller than I remembered, her face pale and drawn, dark circles beneath puffy eyes. "Can I come in?" she asked hesitantly. Eric looked at me questioningly, and I nodded. He squeezed my hand, then stood. "I'll get some coffee and give you two some privacy." As the door closed, Mom approached the bed slowly, as if afraid I might send her away. When she saw my face up close, the bruises now turning purple, she covered her mouth with her hand, fresh tears spilling down her cheeks. "I'm so sorry," she whispered, her voice breaking. "Louise, I am so sorry." Part of me wanted to turn away, to reject her apology as too little, too late. But the larger part saw what I'd missed during our video calls, the haunted look in her eyes, the slight tremor in her hands, the way she flinched at sudden movements. Classic signs of trauma that I'd been trained to recognize in others but had somehow overlooked in my own mother. "Sit down, Mom," I said, gesturing to the chair Eric had vacated. She perched on the edge, hands twisting nervously in her lap. "I never thought he'd hurt you," she said. "He threatened to so many times, but I thought it was just talk. I thought if I stayed with him, if I did everything he wanted, he would leave you alone." "How long has he been hurting you?" I asked, though I already knew the answer. "Since about a year after we married," she admitted. "It started with pushing, grabbing too hard, then slaps that he'd apologize for immediately, promise never to do again. By the time it got really bad, I was trapped. He controlled all our money, isolated me from friends, convinced me I was worthless and lucky to have him." She took a shuddering breath. "He threatened to kill you if I ever left him. Said he would find you no matter where you went. I believed him, Louise. I stayed to protect you, but in the end, I failed anyway." The twisted logic of abuse victims, something I'd studied but never fully understood until that moment. My mother had endured years of torment, believing it was the only way to keep me safe, while I had resented her for not leaving. What made him come after me now? I asked. Your birthday card, she replied. You sent a card with a note saying your door was always open for me. Frank found it. He went into a rage. He'd been drinking all evening, getting angrier and angrier. He kept saying you were trying to steal me away, destroy our marriage. He forced me into the car, said he was going to teach you a lesson. She broke down completely, sobbing into her hands. I should have stopped him. I should have done something. When he started hitting you, I froze. I have never hated myself more than in that moment. A nurse came in to check my pain levels and administer medication. By the time she left, my mother had composed herself somewhat, though her eyes remained red-rimmed and haunted. The police want to know if I'm pressing charges, I told her. I am. He belongs in prison, Mom. She nodded slowly. I know. I already told them I'll testify against him. I'm done being afraid, Louise. It took seeing him hurt you to finally understand there's no protecting anyone by staying silent. My colleague Catherine arrived that afternoon, having heard about the assault from Eric. She brought resources for both Mom and me, information about victim services, therapy options, support groups. More importantly, she connected us with Jessica, a lawyer who specialized in domestic violence cases. Jessica visited me in the hospital the following day, explaining the legal process ahead. Frank has been denied bail due to the severity of the attack and the flight risk, she informed us. The prosecutor is charging him with multiple felonies. With your testimony and your mother's, plus the physical evidence, we have a strong case. Mom stayed in a hotel near the hospital, visiting daily as I recovered. We talked more openly than we had in years, painful conversations about the past and tentative ones about the future. She agreed to see a therapist who specialized in domestic abuse, the first step in a long healing process for both of us. After 5 days, I was discharged, my arm in a sling, prescriptions for pain management, and follow-up appointments. Eric insisted I stay at his apartment until mine was repaired and secured with better locks. Mom came too, taking Eric's spare room while I took his bed, and he slept on the couch despite my protests. In those first weeks of recovery, as my body slowly healed and the legal case against Frank took shape, Mom and I began the delicate process of rebuilding our relationship. There were moments of tension, of unspoken resentment bubbling to the surface, but also moments of unexpected connection. We were two survivors now, bound by shared trauma, but also by the possibility of freedom from Frank's shadow. 3 months after the attack, I stood outside the Suffolk County Courthouse, my hand gripping Eric's tightly. My shoulder had healed enough that I no longer needed the sling, though certain movements still caused pain. The physical therapist said I might always have some limitation in that joint, a permanent reminder of that night. The courthouse was imposing, granite columns and broad steps designed to intimidate with their grandeur. Inside, polished marble floors echoed with hurried footsteps, whispered conversations, and the occasional commanding voice calling a case number. The air smelled of furniture polish and anxiety. Jessica met us in the lobby, professional in a navy suit, her briefcase bulging with documents. Are you ready? She asked, her eyes evaluating my emotional state. I nodded, adjusting the collar of my own suit, chosen carefully to project strength and credibility. As ready as I'll ever be. Mom joined us moments later, having arrived separately from the domestic violence shelter where she'd been staying. The weeks of safety and support had begun to transform her. She stood straighter, made eye contact more consistently, spoke with greater confidence. The shelter had connected her with job counseling and helped her start the divorce process. Frank is already inside with his attorney, Jessica informed us. Remember what we practiced. Answer questions directly. Don't let them provoke emotional responses. We have the facts and evidence on our side. The courtroom fell silent as we entered, all eyes turning to assess us. Frank sat at the defense table, impeccably dressed in an expensive suit, his silver hair perfectly styled. He looked more like a CEO than a man accused of violent assault. Beside him sat his lawyer, Thomas Wilson, known for representing wealthy clients and securing favorable outcomes through aggressive tactics. Frank's eyes met mine briefly, a flash of contempt crossing his features before he composed himself. I refused to look away, holding his gaze until he turned to whisper something to his attorney. That small victory steadied me as we took our seats behind the prosecution table. The proceedings began with opening statements. The prosecutor, Maria Delgado, outlined the case clearly and forcefully, detailing the break-in, the assault, and my injuries. She highlighted Frank's history of controlling behavior and the premeditated nature of the attack. Wilson's opening painted a vastly different picture. Frank is a concerned stepfather, worried about my influence on my mother, who had gone to have a conversation that escalated when I allegedly became hysterical and attacked him, forcing him to defend himself. The fabrication was so outrageous, I had to grip the bench to keep from objecting. "They'll try to twist everything," Jessica whispered. "Let the evidence speak for itself." When called to testify, I walked to the witness stand with deliberate calm, swore to tell the truth, and faced the courtroom. For nearly 2 hours, I answered the prosecutor's questions, describing my childhood after Frank entered our lives, the escalating control, the isolation of my mother, and finally, in excruciating detail, the events of that October night. And at any point, Delgado asked, "Did you attack or threaten Mr. Sullivan prior to him breaking down your door?" "No," I stated firmly. "I never even opened the door." I asked him to leave and said I would call the police if he didn't. Wilson's cross-examination was exactly as Jessica had prepared me for: aggressive, manipulative, designed to provoke emotional responses that might make me appear unstable. "Is it not true, Miss Moore, that you have been trying to separate your mother from your stepfather for years?" he demanded. "I have been trying to help my mother escape an abusive relationship," I corrected calmly. "And you sent materials about leaving one's spouse to your mother's home, knowing they would likely be discovered by Mr. Sullivan?" "I sent information about domestic violence resources because I feared for her safety." He attempted to paint me as vindictive, resentful of Frank's authority, determined to destroy their marriage out of jealousy. With each question, I took a breath before answering, sticking to facts, refusing to be baited into anger. My mother's testimony the following day was both heartbreaking and powerful. Her voice shook initially as she described 12 years of escalating abuse, but grew stronger as she detailed Frank's threats, the financial control, the isolation, and finally the night he forced her into the car to confront me. "He said he was going to teach Louise a lesson for trying to turn me against him," she testified. "I was terrified he would hurt her, but too afraid to defy him. When he started hitting her, I froze. It was like watching a nightmare I couldn't wake up from." Wilson's attempt to discredit her by suggesting she was mentally unstable or seeking financial gain through divorce backfired when Mom calmly described how Frank had ensured she had no access to money, no credit in her name, no way to support herself independently. The medical evidence was presented next: photographs of my injuries, the doctor's report detailing the dislocated shoulder, fractured ribs, concussion, and facial contusions. The emergency room physician testified about the significant force required to cause such injuries. The jury visibly reacted to the images, several members looking at Frank with undisguised disgust. Officer Rivera and her partner described the scene they found at my apartment: the broken door, blood on the wall, my unconscious form on the floor, Frank still raging as they restrained him. The partial recording from my emergency call was played in court, my screams and Frank's threats filling the silent room. Throughout the week-long trial, I endured Frank's cold stare each day, refusing to be intimidated. Eric sat beside me constantly, his presence a steady anchor. My colleagues from the mental health center came to show support, as did Professor Levine, who had driven up from Boston University. On the final day, during closing arguments, I requested permission to address the court directly. The judge, after conferring with both attorneys, allowed it. Standing before the jury, I spoke from the heart. What happened to me that night was not an isolated incident of rage, but the culmination of years of control and abuse. My stepfather did not just attack me physically. He spent years systematically destroying my mother's sense of self, isolating her from support, convincing her that his abuse was love and protection. Domestic violence thrives in silence and shame. Today, by speaking the truth, my mother and I refuse to be silenced any longer. The jury deliberated for just 2 hours before returning with their verdict. As the four women stood, the courtroom fell completely silent. On the charge of breaking and entering, we find the defendant guilty. On the charge of assault and battery with intent to cause grievous bodily harm, we find the defendant guilty. Relief washed over me, so intense I nearly collapsed. Mom gripped my hand, tears streaming down her face. Frank's composed facade finally cracked, his face contorting with rage as the bailiffs approached to take him into custody. At the sentencing hearing 2 weeks later, the judge showed no leniency. "Mr. Sullivan, you have used your position of trust to terrorize your family for years. This court sentences you to 15 years in state prison." As they led Frank away, I felt a weight lift that I had carried for so long. I had forgotten what it was like to stand straight. For the first time since I was 12 years old, I could breathe freely, without fear of the man who had cast such a long shadow over our lives. 2 years after the trial, on a bright spring morning, I stood before a small audience in the community room of the Boston Women's Shelter. My hair had grown out since I'd cut it short after the attack, now falling in soft waves past my shoulders. The physical scars had faded, though my right shoulder still ached in cold weather and would never regain its full range of motion. "My name is Louise Moore," I began, "and today I want to talk about the journey from victim to survivor to thriver." The women watching me knew parts of my story already. Some had attended support groups I facilitated. Others had received counseling at the Breakthrough Center, the organization I had founded with my recently completed master's degree in trauma psychology. After the trial, I had thrown myself into completing my education, determined to turn my experience into something meaningful. With guidance from Professor Levine and a grant from a victims advocacy foundation, I had established a small but growing center dedicated to helping domestic violence survivors rebuild their lives. 2 years ago, I lay in a hospital bed, broken physically and emotionally. I continued. Today, I stand before you, not because the pain magically disappeared, but because I learned to carry it differently. Healing is not a straight line. It's messy and non-linear. There are setbacks and breakthroughs, often on the same day. My mother sat in the front row, pride evident in her smile. She had lived with me for 6 months after the trial, attending therapy 3 times a week, gradually finding her voice and identity again. Now she had her own apartment near mine and worked part-time at a local bookstore, slowly building an independent life. Our relationship had transformed through countless difficult conversations, tears, and eventually, genuine forgiveness. Not forgiveness for Frank, but for ourselves and each other. For the times we had failed to understand, failed to act, failed to support one another under impossible circumstances. The hardest lesson I learned, I told the audience, was that you cannot save someone who is not ready to be saved, but you can create a safe space for them to come to when they are ready. You can leave a light on in the darkness. Eric sat beside my mother, the diamond on my left hand catching the light when I gestured. Our engagement was recent, a step we had taken only after much thought and discussion. Eric had been incredibly patient, understanding that trauma changes a person's relationship with trust and intimacy. He had never pushed, never rushed, simply remained steady as I worked through my healing process. The physical recovery had been challenging. Months of physical therapy had restored most function to my shoulder, though certain movements remained painful. The nightmares had been worse, vivid recreations of the attack that left me drenched in sweat and trembling. With therapy and medication, they had gradually decreased, now occurring only during particularly stressful periods. Trauma lives in the body, I explained to the group. It affects us physically, emotionally, spiritually. Healing must address all these dimensions. I had practiced what I preached, combining traditional therapy with yoga, meditation, and even art classes. Painting had become an unexpected outlet, my amateur attempts at expressing emotion through color and form hanging in my office as reminders of the healing journey. My mother had found her own path to recovery. After decades of having her preferences dismissed by Frank, she had systematically rediscovered herself, her favorite foods, colors, music, hobbies. She had started wearing bright red lipstick again, taken up gardening, joined a book club. Small acts of reclamation that together formed a new identity, one defined by choice rather than fear. The turning point in my healing, I continued, came when I realized that holding on to hatred for my abuser was keeping me connected to him. By focusing my energy on anger, I was allowing him to continue controlling my emotional life from prison. True freedom came with letting go, not of accountability, but of the corrosive power of hatred. This had been the most difficult aspect of recovery. The rage had felt righteous, protective, necessary. Learning to release it without minimizing the harm done had taken the guidance of skilled therapists and the support of others who understood from experience. The Breakthrough Center had grown beyond my initial vision. We now offered individual counseling, support groups, career development workshops, and housing assistance. A network of volunteer attorneys provided legal guidance. Former clients returned as peer mentors, creating a community of mutual support. One such success story was Nancy, a woman in her 40s who had attended one of my first public speaking engagements. After 15 years with an abusive husband, she had found the courage to leave, inspired partly by hearing my story. Now she volunteered at the center, her accounting skills proving invaluable to clients rebuilding financial independence. The greatest myth about abuse, I told the audience, is that it only happens to certain types of people, those who are weak or codependent. The truth is that abuse can happen to anyone. Victims don't need our judgment. They need our compassion and practical support. As I concluded my talk, I looked around at the faces before me. Some bearing visible scars, others carrying wounds invisible to the eye, but no less real. Each person represented both a tragedy and a triumph, lives derailed by violence, but refusing to be defined by it. My stepfather took many things from me and my mother, I said. Years of peace, a sense of safety, physical well-being. But he failed to take what matters most, our capacity to heal, to love, to build something new from the wreckage. That resilience lives in every one of you. It's not something special or unique to me. It is the fundamental human ability to begin again, no matter how many times we have been broken. The applause was warm as I finished, several women wiping away tears. As they gathered around to speak with me afterward, sharing their own stories and challenges, I felt the familiar mix of sorrow and hope that now characterized my work. Each conversation reminded me that healing happens in connection, not isolation. We recover ourselves through helping others recover. Later that evening, Eric and I hosted a small dinner at our apartment. My mother brought her famous apple pie, Catherine from work came with her husband, and Professor Levine drove up from the university. Surrounded by this chosen family, I reflected on how far we had all come. A toast, Eric suggested, raising his glass. To Louise, whose courage continues to inspire everyone around her. I shook my head, raising my own glass. To all of us. To choosing love over fear, connection over isolation, and hope over despair. Every single day. As conversation and laughter filled the apartment that had once been the site of such violence, I felt the truth of what I had told the women earlier: trauma changes you permanently. There is no going back to who you were before. But with support, determination, and time, you can build something new and meaningful from the pieces that remain. What happened that night 7 years ago will always be part of my story. But it is no longer the defining chapter. It is simply one part of a much larger narrative about resilience, compassion, and the transformative power of breaking silence.